Darkness fell over the city, but it wasn't the night that terrified the people, it was the screams. Mark Henderson had never considered himself a fighter. He was just a mechanic, working long hours in a dead-end job. His biggest worries had been rent and overdue bills. But as he stood in the doorway of his apartment, staring at his next-door neighbor, a man he had greeted every morning, ripping into his wife's throat with an unnatural hunger, Mark knew life had just taken a turn he wasn't ready for. "Help me," the woman gargled through a mouthful of blood, her eyes locking onto Mark's. But he couldn't move. He was frozen, watching in horror as the man's teeth tore through flesh, a sickening squelch filling the air. It was only when the man turned toward him, blood dripping from his mouth, that Mark stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. His hands trembled as he locked the door. The muffled sounds of chaos outside, the distant wail of sirens, the screams of people, the guttural moans, made his stomach twist. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "Mark." His sister, Julie, her voice frantic. "Are you safe?" I don't know," he admitted, his breath shaky. "Something's happening, Jules. My neighbor, he killed his wife. I saw it. It's everywhere," she whispered. "People are eating each other. Mom and Dad's neighborhood is, Mark, they didn't make it." A lump formed in his throat. He wanted to deny it, wanted to tell her that they'd find a way to fix this, but deep down, he knew the truth. Their parents were gone. "I need to get to you," he said instead. "Where are you?" "At my dorm. We barricaded the doors, but some of them," her voice cracked. "They got in. Mark, please." The line went dead. Mark's heart pounded. Julie was all he had left. He grabbed his car keys, but as he reached for the door, an ear-splitting scream tore through the hallway. The peephole revealed a nightmare, a woman being tackled by 3 bloodied figures, her hands clawing at the air as they descended upon her. He needed another way out. The fire escape. Mark rushed to the window, shoving it open. Cold air hit his face as he climbed out, gripping the metal railing. Below, the streets were madness. People ran, some screaming for help, others already on the ground being torn apart. A burning car lit up the night, smoke curling into the sky. This wasn't just some outbreak. This was the end. He climbed down quickly, boots hitting the pavement just as a man lunged at him from the alley. His face was twisted in rage, eyes wild and bloodshot. His fingers clawed from Mark's throat. Mark barely reacted in time, dodging to the side. "Hey, man, stop," he shouted. The man didn't stop. He came again, mouth snapping like a rabid animal. Something inside Mark snapped. He wasn't going to die here. He grabbed a loose brick from the ground and swung. The impact sent a sickening crunch through the air, and the man collapsed. Mark stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had just killed someone. Or had he? The way the man had moved, his hunger, his rage, it wasn't human. Mark didn't wait to find out. The streets were a battlefield. As he ran, he saw others fighting for their lives, an old man swinging a baseball bat at a group of monsters, a young woman screaming as she was dragged into a shattered store window. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man trying to get to his sister. But if he wanted to survive, he needed to be more than that. He needed to be a killer. Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. The city around him was crumbling. Fires raged unchecked, smoke curling into the night sky. The roads were littered with wrecked cars, some flipped over, others blood-stained with shattered windshields and doors flung open, testaments to the people who had tried to escape but never made it. His sister's dorm was still a few miles away, but every turn brought a new obstacle. Some roads were completely blocked, abandoned vehicles forming an impassable wall. Others were worse, shuffling figures moving in erratic patterns, their moans carried through the wind like a haunting melody of death. He had seen plenty of horror movies, but none of them prepared him for the real thing. A distant scream snapped him out of his daze. At the next intersection, a family was trapped. A father, mother, and young boy huddled together near a disabled SUV, their only protection against a horde of zombies closing in. The father had a tire iron, swinging wildly, but for every one he knocked down, two more closed the distance. Mark slammed the brakes, his gut twisting. He had seconds to decide. He could keep going, leave them behind and focus on Julie. Or he could help. Damn it. He threw the car in park, yanked the door open, and grabbed the wrench from his glove compartment before sprinting toward them. The father barely noticed him through his desperation. His wife screamed as a creature lunged at her, and the boy sobbed into her jacket. Mark didn't hesitate. He swung the wrench, the weight of it sending a shock through his arms as it cracked against a zombie's skull. The thing collapsed, but another one took its place. "Get in the car!" Mark shouted, gripping the boy's arm and dragging him toward the SUV. The mother scrambled in, yanking the child inside. The father kept fighting. "Damn it, man, we have to go." Mark grabbed his sleeve, but the man shoved him off. "My wife, she's..." The woman let out a strangled gasp. Mark turned just in time to see blood spilling down her shoulder, her eyes wide with terror as teeth sank into her flesh. There was no saving her. Mark wrenched the father away, forcing him into the driver's seat. "Drive." The man's face was blank, frozen in shock, but Mark slammed the door and pounded on it. "Go before you get your son killed." That did it. The SUV roared to life, tires screeching as the vehicle tore down the road, leaving behind a woman who was already doomed. Mark stumbled back, panting. The undead had turned their attention toward him. And he was alone. He sprinted back to his car, but before he could reach it, a hand latched onto his ankle. He crashed onto the pavement, breath knocked from his lungs. He twisted, the stench of rotting flesh choking him as a snarling corpse crawled over him. Its jaws snapped inches from his face. Mark fought wildly, shoving his forearm under its throat to keep it back. His free hand fumbled for anything, his wrench had slipped from his grasp. The thing growled, pressing its weight against him, forcing his arm lower. Then a gunshot rang out. The zombie's head exploded, and Mark was suddenly drenched in warm, sticky blood. He gasped, shoving the body off and scrambling to his feet. A woman stood a few yards away, lowering a pistol. She was lean, with a rugged look, short dark hair, a backpack slung over her shoulder. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto him. "You look like you needed help," she said flatly. Mark coughed, still catching his breath. "Yeah, thanks." She studied him for a moment before nodding toward his car. "You planning on surviving, or just getting yourself killed?" Mark wiped the blood from his face. "I need to get to my sister." The woman considered this before nodding. "Then you better learn to move faster." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Mark exhaled sharply and climbed into his car. Julie was still waiting. And there was no time to mourn. The city was a graveyard. Mark drove through the ruins, gripping the wheel with a determination he hadn't known he possessed. The scent of burning buildings and rotting flesh hung in the air, a sickening mix that clung to his clothes and skin. He had seen death before, but never like this. Not like what he had left behind. His hands were still trembling from what had happened with that family. From the moment he had to make the decision, the choice between saving them or saving himself. The woman's screams still echoed in his head. But he had saved the boy. That had to count for something. His fuel gauge blinked. Half a tank. It would be enough to get into Julie's dorm, but after that? He wasn't sure. A flicker of movement on the street ahead made him tense. He slowed the car. It wasn't the mindless shuffle of the undead. No, this was different. Someone was moving fast, darting between the wreckage. Survivors. Mark's first instinct was relief. Maybe they had information. Maybe they could help. Then he saw the way they moved, crouching low, weapons in hand. Not just survivors. Predators. His gut twisted. He had been so focused on the zombies that he hadn't considered the other danger, people. A baseball bat slammed against his windshield. "Out of the car, asshole!" A man in a ragged hoodie, his face smeared with dirt and blood, snarled at him through the glass. Another figure moved to his side, pounding on the driver's door. "We know you got supplies. Open up." Mark's mind raced. There were 3 of them. Maybe more in the shadows. He had no choice. He threw the car into reverse. The tires screeched as he swung the vehicle around, but one of the looters was already yanking at the door handle. Mark reacted without thinking. He grabbed the wrench from the passenger seat and swung. The man's grip loosened as the tool cracked against his arm, and he stumbled back with a curse. Mark hit the gas. The car surged backward, slamming into someone. The sickening thud sent a jolt through his spine, but he didn't stop. Not until he was clear. He spun the wheel, sending the car fishtailing before straightening out and speeding down the road. His heart was pounding. His breath came in ragged gasps. He had just hurt someone, maybe killed them. He wasn't sure how to feel about it. But the fear, the guilt, it was already fading. Because if he hadn't done it, they would have killed him. That was the world now. A distant explosion rattled the ground, and Mark forced himself to focus. Julie was waiting. The dorm was eerily quiet when he arrived. Too quiet. His hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the wrench tighter, creeping up the stairwell. The building had been barricaded, piles of furniture stacked in front of the doors. That meant survivors had been here. But were they still alive? Mark reached the 3rd floor, heart hammering. Julie's room was at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly open. His throat tightened. Taking a slow breath, he pushed it open wider, stepping inside. The sight made his stomach drop. The room was trashed. Blood smeared across the floor, broken furniture scattered everywhere. His sister's backpack was overturned, its contents spilled. And then he saw the body. Not Julie. A man, his chest torn open, intestines spilling onto the floor. A zombie. But it wasn't moving. A sharp gasp made Mark spin. In the corner, curled up in the closet, was Julie. She was alive. "Mark?" Her voice was small, disbelieving. Relief crashed over him like a wave. "Jules!" She stumbled into his arms, shaking. I thought you weren't coming." He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair. "I told you I'd find you." She pulled back, eyes wide. "We have to go." "More of them." A low growl from the hallway cut her off. Mark turned. The dead had found them. And this time, there was no running. No hesitation. Mark raised his wrench. It was time to kill. Mark didn't think. He swung. The wrench cracked into the zombie's skull, splitting bone and sending it crumpling to the floor. The impact jarred his arm, but there was no time to react. Another one lunged through the doorway, its rotting hands clawing at the air between them. Julie screamed. Mark grabbed her wrist and pulled. They ran. The hallway was a gauntlet of death. Doors were broken open, blood pooled in the dimly lit corridors, and shadows twisted as more undead emerged. The dorm had once been a refuge, but now it was a death trap. "Stairs!" Julie gasped, pointing ahead. They reached the stairwell just as more zombies began stumbling toward them from the far end of the hall. Mark shoved the door open, nearly tripping as they rushed down. Every step felt like a countdown to disaster. "Where's your car?" Julie panted. "Gone. I had to ditch it." "Great. That's just..." A door burst open below them, and a mass of undead poured in. Julie cursed. "We're trapped." Mark's mind raced. Think. They needed high ground. Some were defensible. The roof. He pivoted, dragging Julie back up the steps. "We have to go up. But just trust me." They reached the top floor, sprinting through another hallway until they found a metal ladder leading up to the maintenance hatch. Mark jumped, yanking it down. "Go!" he shouted. Julie scrambled up. Mark followed, shoving the hatch open and hoisting himself onto the roof just as the first zombies slammed into the ladder below. They were trapped. Panting, Mark scanned the area. The roof stretched across the entire dorm, but there was no way down that wouldn't break their legs. Across the way, a fire escape clung to the next building over, a 2-story gap between them and potential safety. Julie noticed it too. "No way. That's suicide." Mark wiped sweat from his brow. "You got a better idea?" Julie looked around, then froze. "Mark, we're not alone." He turned. A group of survivors stood at the far end of the roof, weapons drawn. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, the tallest of the group, a man with piercing blue eyes and a rifle slung over his shoulder, stepped forward. "You two just made a lot of noise," he said. Mark swallowed. "We were trying not to die." The man studied them, then glanced at the horde gathering below. "Well, looks like you need a way out." Mark tensed. "You offering one?" The man smirked. "Depends. Can you fight?" Mark looked down at the bloodied wrench in his hand. He thought about everything he'd seen. Everything he'd done. He wasn't the same person he'd been a day ago. "Yeah," he said. "I can fight." The man grinned. "Good." Mark kept his grip tight on the wrench, eyeing the survivors across the roof. They were hardened, battle-worn, but their expressions weren't hostile. "Not yet." The man with the rifle stepped closer, sizing him up. "Name's Connor," he said. "And you just crashed our safe zone." Mark didn't lower his guard. "We didn't have a choice. The building was overrun." Connor gave a slow nod. "Yeah, we heard. You made enough noise to wake the dead." He smirked. "And you brought company." Mark glanced over the edge. The zombies below had multiplied, their grotesque forms writhing against each other as they tried to find a way up. If they stayed here too long, they'd be cornered. Connor turned to his group. "We're moving out." 5 minutes. Julie hesitated. "Wait, you're leaving?" A woman with dark skin and a hunting knife strapped to her leg scoffed. "We don't stay in one place too long, sweetheart. It gets people killed." Connor gave Mark a pointed look. "You two can come with us, if you can keep up." Mark met Julie's gaze. She was exhausted, shaken, but alive. And staying here wasn't an option. "We'll keep up," he said. Connor smirked. "We'll see about that." The escape. The plan was simple, but dangerous. The survivors had rigged a zip line from the roof to an adjacent parking garage. It was old, rusted, and probably unsafe, but it was their only option. One by one, they hooked onto the line and zipped across. Julie went ahead of Mark, her terrified scream echoing as she shot over the abyss. Mark followed, gripping the handle so tight his fingers ached. The wind howled in his ears, and for a moment, his stomach dropped, but then his boots slammed onto concrete. He barely had time to breathe before Connor shoved a crowbar into his hands. "Hope you're ready," Connor muttered. "We've got company." The undead had followed them into the garage. They came in droves, groaning as they squeezed between rusted cars and debris. Mark took a shaky breath. His arms still ached from the last fight, but there was no room for hesitation. Julie stood behind him, clutching a makeshift weapon, a broken pipe. She wasn't the same scared girl he had found in the dorm. She was ready to fight. Connor barked orders. "Keep moving. Take them out fast." Mark swung. The crowbar connected with a zombie's temple, sending it crashing to the floor. Another one lunged, he sidestepped, bringing the weapon down and a brutal arc. Blood sprayed across his shirt, but he barely noticed. Julie took down her first zombie. Then her second. The fear in her eyes didn't disappear, but it didn't stop her either. For the first time since the outbreak, Mark realized something. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were becoming something else. A new path. After clearing the garage, the group took shelter in an abandoned gas station. It was the first time Mark had sat down in hours. His body ached, his knuckles were bruised, and his heart still raced from the fight. Connor sat across from him, chewing on a protein bar. Not bad, he admitted. Most people don't last their first real fight. Mark exhaled. Guess I'm not most people. Connor smirked. Guess not. Julie sat beside him, her hands still shaking. But there was something else in her eyes now. Not just fear. Determination. She wasn't the same girl who had hidden in that closet. And Mark wasn't the same man who had hesitated when the world fell apart. Connor leaned back. We're heading west. There's a settlement, real safety. You want in? Mark didn't even have to think about it. We're in. The night was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Mark sat with his back against the gas station's wall, gripping the crowbar across his lap. The others were resting, Julie curled up beside him, Connor and his crew scattered around the room. A single lantern flickered in the center, casting long shadows across the shelves of expired snacks and overturned displays. They had survived the dorm. They had fought their way out of the parking garage. But Mark knew better than to think they were safe. The world didn't allow for safe anymore. Connor was speaking in hushed tones with his second-in-command, a woman named Reese. She was sharp-eyed and quiet, the kind of person who had clearly seen too much death to waste words on strangers. Mark only caught a few bits of their conversation. Can't take them with us if they slow us down. He stiffened. Reese didn't look convinced. They pulled their weight today. Connor exhaled. For now. But it's different when you're starving. When the real choices come. Mark clenched his jaw. He didn't trust Connor. Not fully. The guy was experienced, sure. A survivor. But he wasn't looking out for Mark and Julie. He was looking out for himself. Julie stirred, rubbing her eyes. What's wrong? Nothing, Mark lied. Just thinking. She sighed, resting her head against the shelf. We don't have a choice, do we? We have to stick with them. For now. Neither of them said what they were really thinking. For now, but not forever. The ambush. Morning came fast. Connor led the group west, moving quickly through abandoned neighborhoods and shattered highways. They stuck to side streets, avoiding the wreckage of civilization. The dead were still everywhere, but Connor knew how to move unseen. Mark watched him carefully, learning. It wasn't just about killing zombies. It was about avoiding them when you could. Picking the right paths. Knowing when to fight and when to run. They moved through an empty strip mall, the air thick with decay. Mark's stomach twisted. He hadn't eaten in a day. We'll rest here, Connor announced, gesturing toward an old diner. The windows were smashed, but the inside looked mostly intact. Mark and Julie followed, stepping over broken glass as they entered. The scent of mildew and stale grease filled the air. Then, gunfire. Bullets tore through the windows, shattering what little remained. Mark dove behind a booth, yanking Julie down with him. Shit! Reese hissed, returning fire from behind the counter. Connor cursed. Raiders. Mark's heart pounded. Not zombies. People. A gruff voice called from outside. We know you got supplies. Drop your weapons, and we might let you live. Mark peeked over the booth. 5 of them, armed and spread out. Hunters. The kind that didn't scavenge, they took from others. Connor growled. Like hell. Another gunshot. The bullet missed by inches, splintering the wood beside Mark's head. Julie was shaking. Mark wasn't. He gripped his crowbar. He wasn't just some scared civilian anymore. He was a fighter. Connor signaled. We hit them fast, or we die. Got it? Mark nodded. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was war. The world had changed. It wasn't just about avoiding zombies anymore. It wasn't even about surviving. It was about winning. Mark took a steadying breath, gripping the crowbar like a lifeline. Gunfire rattled through the shattered diner windows, sending shards of glass and dust into the air. The raiders were outside, spread out, thinking they had control. They were wrong. Connor's voice was low but sharp. We take the fight to them. No hesitation. Mark nodded. He wasn't sure when he had started following Connor's orders without question, but it didn't matter. Right now, they had to act. Julie was beside him, eyes wide but focused. She was scared, but not frozen. Not useless. Reese reloaded her pistol. 3 of them on the left, 2 covering the street. Connor smirked. Then we go right. Mark's pulse pounded as Connor counted down with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. Then, chaos. Connor kicked the side door open and fired in a single motion, dropping one of the raiders before they could react. Reese followed, moving with deadly precision. Mark didn't have a gun. But he had speed. He burst through the door and saw one of the raiders fumbling with their rifle, panicked, not expecting a full-blown counterattack. Mark swung the crowbar. The metal connected with the man's wrist, shattering it instantly. He screamed, dropping his gun. Mark didn't stop. He swung again, this time cracking into the raider's skull. The body hit the ground, twitching. Mark barely had time to process what he had done. Another raider spotted him and raised their weapon. Julie lunged from behind, slamming her pipe into the woman's ribs. The raider stumbled, and before she could recover, Mark finished it, a clean, brutal strike to the head. Julie was panting, hands shaking. Did we? Connor's rifle cracked in the distance. Then, silence. Mark turned, chest heaving. The other raiders were dead. Connor wiped blood off his knife. That's how you handle an ambush. Reese kicked one of the corpses over, checking for supplies. Idiots never had a chance. Mark barely heard them. He was staring at the body at his feet. The one he had killed. Julie was watching him. Are you okay? Mark exhaled slowly. The truth? He felt nothing. Not horror. Not regret. Not guilt. Just acceptance. This was the world now. And he was ready for it. The bodies lay sprawled across the pavement, blood pooling into the cracks of the broken asphalt. Mark wiped the crowbar against his jeans, his hands still slick with sweat. His heart wasn't racing anymore. The fear that once gripped him in moments like these was fading. Julie stared at him. Not with fear, but with understanding. She had changed too. Connor holstered his gun and glanced at the wreckage of their ambushers. They were scouting for a bigger group, he muttered. We need to be gone before they come looking. Reese nodded, already rifling through the corpses. They've got food, ammo, she paused, pulling out a folded map from one of the dead men's pockets. And coordinates. Connor snatched it from her hands, scanning the markings. A settlement. Julie perked up. A real one? Looks like it, Connor muttered. Could be the same place we've been hearing about. Mark shifted. And what if it's hostile? Connor gave him a cold smile. Then we do what we do best. Mark understood. If they couldn't join, they would take a fork in the road. They moved quickly, cutting through back streets and abandoned houses. The city was dying, nature reclaiming what was left. Cars were rusting, vines creeping through shattered buildings, and the only sounds were the distant groans of the undead. Mark had stopped fearing those sounds. It was people who scared him now. Julie walked beside him, her grip tight on the pipe she'd taken from the diner. Are we really going to this settlement? Mark nodded. It's the best shot we have. She hesitated. But with them? He glanced at Connor and Reese, leading the group ahead. They were strong. Smart. Dangerous. Mark had learned from them. But deep down, he knew Connor wasn't a leader. He was a predator. Julie bit her lip. I don't trust them. Neither do I. She exhaled. So what do we do? Mark looked ahead. The settlement was still miles away. Anything could happen before they got there. We wait, he murmured. And when the time comes, we make our move. Julie's fingers brushed against his. Just for a second. An understanding. A pact. They were in this together. The road to salvation, or ruin. As night fell, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley below. And there it was. The settlement. Fences lined the perimeter. Guard towers stood tall. Lights. Actual electricity. It was real. Julie's breath hitched. Mark? Connor grinned. Looks like we found paradise. Mark wasn't so sure. Because if paradise still existed in this world, then what kind of monsters were protecting it? Mark crouched behind the tall grass, eyes fixed on the settlement below. From a distance, it looked like a miracle: walls, electricity, armed guards patrolling the perimeter. A piece of the old world, somehow untouched by the apocalypse. But Mark had learned one thing since the world ended. Nothing is ever as good as it seems. Connor was grinning like a wolf eyeing fresh prey. This is it. Food. Shelter. Safety. Reese adjusted her rifle scope. They've got a watchtower every 100 yards. Armed. Organized. Julie tensed beside Mark. And what happens when they don't let us in? Connor shrugged. Then we make our way in. Mark's stomach twisted. He knew what that meant. Violence. Blood. Another fight. The group moved closer, sticking to the tree line until they reached an abandoned road leading to the settlement's main gate. Mark's grip tightened on his crowbar. Julie's knuckles were white around her pipe. This was it. A chance at a real future, or another death trap. Inside the walls. Connor raised his hands as they approached the gate. We're survivors, he called out. Looking for a home. Silence. Then, movement. A figure stepped onto the catwalk above. A woman. Blonde, tough-looking, with a military stance. She wore a Kevlar vest and held a scoped rifle, but her expression wasn't hostile. Names, she demanded. Connor answered smoothly. Connor. This is Reese. Mark. Julie. The woman studied them. Weapons? Connor hesitated. For protection. We'll decide that. The gates groaned as they opened, revealing armed guards waiting inside. Mark's pulse quickened. He shot a glance at Julie. She looked as uneasy as he felt. They stepped through. And the gates slammed shut behind them. A perfect prison. Inside, the settlement was thriving. People worked in gardens. Children played near a fountain. There was clean water, warm fires, real homes. It was everything they had dreamed of. But Mark could feel it, the tension in the air. The blonde woman, who introduced herself as Captain Sloan, led them toward a repurposed city hall. You'll be given food and medical checks, she explained. Then, an interview. We don't let just anyone stay here. Connor nodded, playing along. Of course. But Mark saw it in his eyes. The calculation. The opportunism. Connor wasn't here to join. He was here to take. Julie whispered to Mark as they walked. Something's off. He agreed. But what? They were led into separate rooms. Mark sat alone, the walls bare except for a single light above him. Then, the door opened. Captain Sloan stepped inside. She sat across from him, folding her hands. Tell me, Mark, she said, voice even. Are you a good person? Mark's throat went dry. Because for the first time since the world ended, he wasn't sure anymore. Mark sat frozen under the harsh light, Captain Sloane's question lingering in the stale air. Are you a good person? Before the outbreak, he would have answered without hesitation. But now? After everything? After the blood on his hands, the people he had left behind, the ones he had killed? He wasn't sure. Sloane studied him, her expression unreadable. You hesitated. Mark swallowed. Because it's not a simple answer. Good. She leaned forward. Only liars say yes without thinking. Mark glanced at the door. What is this place, really? A community, Sloane said. A real one. We have rules. Structure. And we don't let wolves in among the sheep. The meaning was clear. Connor. A breaking point. Elsewhere in the settlement, Julie sat on a cot in a makeshift medical tent, hands clenched in her lap. She wasn't injured, but the nurse had insisted on evaluations. Her eyes flicked to the guards at the door. 2 of them. Armed. She wasn't a guest. She was a prisoner. She tensed as Connor and Reese were led into the room. Connor had that easy smirk, but his eyes were scanning everything. Calculating. Julie knew that look. He was planning something. This place is a fortress, Connor muttered under his breath. We could own it. Julie's stomach twisted. Or we could stay. Live like normal people again. Connor scoffed. And follow their rules? Be their little worker bees? He leaned in. That's not who we are, Julie. Her jaw clenched. That's not who you are. The revolt. An hour later, alarms blared across the settlement. Gunshots cracked the air. Mark was being led through a hallway when the guards suddenly grabbed their radios. Shit, shots fired near the south wall. Intruders. Then chaos erupted. Mark shoved one of the guards, grabbed his crowbar, and sprinted for the exit. He knew who was responsible. The last stand. By the time he reached the settlement square, it was hell. Connor had started a riot. He and Reese had convinced some of the more desperate survivors to fight. They had stolen weapons, killed guards, and now they were trying to break open the main gate. Sloane's people were retaliating, hard. Gunfire. Screams. Blood staining the clean streets. Julie was in the middle of it, frozen, watching Connor gun down a man trying to protect his family. Mark ran to her. We have to stop this. She looked at him, eyes wide. How? Connor spotted them. Mark. Help us take this place. Mark tightened his grip on the crowbar. Connor had taught him how to survive. How to fight. But now he had to decide who he really was. The past didn't matter. This was about the future. Mark took a breath. Then he turned his weapon on Connor. The choice that changed everything. It wasn't easy. Connor was fast, brutal. But Mark had purpose. They fought in the firelight, dodging and striking, old friends turned enemies. And in the end, Mark's crowbar struck true. Connor staggered, blood dripping from his mouth. He smirked one last time. Guess you finally made your choice. Then he fell. Julie stood beside Mark, breathing hard. The riot died down. Sloane's people regained control. And Mark? For the first time in a long time, he felt human again. Epilogue, a new beginning. Days later, the settlement was rebuilding. Mark and Julie were given a choice, stay or go. They stayed. Not because it was easy. Not because it was perfect. But because, finally, they had something worth fighting for. And in a world overrun by death, that was the most important thing of all. The end.